consider yourself a liberal or a socialist? It's a difficult choice to make, but one that many of us on the left feel that we have to make. Liberalism contains many things that are valuable, including an emphasis on individual rights and a healthy skepticism towards government power. But liberalism often coexists with economic inequality, making its defense of individual rights seem to be little more than rhetoric designed for protecting the worst aspects of capitalism. So you might be attracted to socialism instead, with its emphasis on redistribution and workers' rights. But then you worry that socialists underplay the dangers of centralised power and place too little importance on democracy. It can be difficult to choose, and the hostility between these two camps doesn't make the choice any easier. But what if you didn't have to choose? What if being a liberal socialist was a perfectly coherent and defensible position on the political spectrum? Can we really reconcile and synthesize the best insights of both of these traditions? According to today's guest, Matt McManus, we most certainly can. Matt is a lecturer in political science at the University of Michigan and author of many interesting books on political theory. Today we're discussing his most recent book, The Political Theory of Liberal Socialism. Matt is no stranger to doing podcasts, and that really came across in this effortless interview. I hope you enjoy listening to our conversation as much as I enjoyed having it. Please remember to rate or review the podcast on whatever platform you're using. It really does make a difference. Enjoy. Okay, Matthew McManus, thanks so much for coming on.
Yeah, it's a real pleasure talking to you. Thank you. I was just told that you're doing this on a Saturday morning, which is a lot braver than I'd be, so good for you.
No, thank you for doing it on your Friday evening when you could be going out and having fun.
That's true.
Just so for people who aren't familiar with you, you've just written a book, The Political Theory of Liberal Socialism. But prior to writing this book, you'd actually written a few books about the political right. So I just wanted to ask you briefly, as someone who's very clearly left wing, what motivated you to write a book about conservatism?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I guess there are three motivations behind that. The first one is I grew up in a bunch of different places, in a bunch of different environments, but mainly it's in Stittsville, Ontario, which is now the riding of Pierre Poilievre, the leader of the Conservative Party of Canada, and very likely the next Prime Minister of Canada, I should say. And most of my buddies, people I knew, were pretty to very conservative, right? And that was the social group that I tended to affiliate with all the way down through college. As I say in my book on the right, the political right and equality, I actually won the what became known for a little while, at least, as the Matt McManus Award for best non-conservative member of the Carleton campus conservatives. And that was just purely because of association, friendship, that kind of thing. So I always spent a lot of time around conservatives, and even though from very early on I became very aware that I didn't agree with them on all the issues, I was trying to understand their kind of viewpoint. The second main motivation is a little bit more bratty, let's say. Uh, I just read an awful lot of conservative op-eds through the late 2010s that were constantly, oh, the left doesn't want, the left actually reads conservative authors. And like a lot of people, I was just like, well, we'll see about that then. And I'd like to point out that to a certain extent that continues to this day, albeit not quite as pronounced as it might have been during the debate me bro era. But just the other day, I saw some two or three conservative intellectuals be like, "Oh, nobody reads what we do," in response to us. I'm like, it's not really true anymore. There's quite a few people who do what I do now. Corey Robin, Nathan Robinson, really good book by Larry Allen Buss called "The Right-Wing Mirror of Critical Theory." People should read. And then the last reason is around 2016, as a few people might know, there were some big electoral changes that took place in the world. Donald Trump and other right-wing populists around the same time won office, often promising to enact what looked to many like a very illiberal agenda. And I thought to myself that this would be a good time to go back, crack open my own copies of Reflections on the Revolution in France or Antonin Scalia's A Matter of Interpretation, just to try to figure out what's been going on. And the more I dove into the literature for a decade now, the more I just became interested in trying to figure out what was going on in that tradition. And it's really engaging, right? I mean, I think sometimes leftists prefer to deal with like intra-left disputes, and I don't think that there's anything necessarily wrong with that. But I do think that there's value in these much more kind of what's the way to put it, bifurcated arguments between traditions and ideas that are fundamentally incompatible with one another.
That's quite interesting. Do you think that one can really understand, though, the MAGA movement by reading more intellectual conservative types like Edmund Burke? Like, it seems to me, watching from afar, that sort of Trumpism doesn't really have, and perhaps I'm wrong about this, doesn't really have any intellectual affinities with these more kind of historic conservative figures.
Yeah, it's a great question, and one that I get asked a lot. And my argument is absolutely. You can see a lot of parallels in the argument someone like Burke put forward and the attitudes that conservatives to this day adopt. Now, obviously, it's a lot less intellectually rarefied than what you'd find in Reflections on the Revolution in France, let alone a professional conservative academic like Michael Oakeshott, who I also talk about in relation to Trumpism. But let's just give a couple examples, right? Edmund Burke is extremely insistent in Reflections on the Revolution in France that the main reason for a lot of the turmoil that's appearing in France is the agitation of the philosophes and the intellectuals. And he is scathingly critical of them. And there are a lot of different reasons for this, but it's very important to note that by locating the source of political and social agitation in intellectuals, what he's doing is quite clever because he's exonerating the existing social system of any responsibility for the agitation that's then overthrowing it, and suggesting that there, but for the presence of these nasty philosophes drinking their coffees and coming up with all these radical ideas, society would reform itself, undoubtedly, in a more or less evolutionary way without the necessity of these big revolutionary transitions. And what this really does very effectively, and conservatives down to the present day will continuously reiterate this argument, is deflect blame from existing social institutions and hierarchies towards those who are calling out the problems in those existing institutions and social hierarchies, without actually, of course, needing to answer the objections of people on the left in any kind of sustained way. Which brings me to my next point, which is Burke is extremely insistent, going all the way back to his philosophical inquiry into the origins of the sublime and the beautiful. It's a lengthy title. That human beings are not fundamentally motivated by reason first and foremost. Certainly, it's an important quality that we have to be reasonable, but we are also very agitated and activated by aesthetic ideas, even first and foremost. And you see this continuing into his politics, where he is extremely contemptuous of the rationalists, the calculators, and the sophisters for thinking that you should evaluate political institutions from this kind of God's eye view or this rationalistic view. In fact, he says things continuously like people are often attached to the world for extremely affecting reasons. And a good politician, and especially a good conservative politician, needs to recognize that and understand how to manipulate this. And sometimes he is very, very clear about this in a way that can tell us a lot about what contemporary conservatives do. Just to give one example, he says that if you are ever going to elevate man above man, right, the way that obviously an aristocracy or a monarchy has to do, it is extremely important that you ascribe sublime qualities or inculcate sublime qualities in the people who are to be so elevated. Why? Because people are not going to submit to a person they think is just an ordinary person. They're going to submit to Louis XIV, the Sun King, right? Because they think that he is ordained by God to sit upon the throne of France. And not coincidentally, Burke then says religious institutions should also be created to ascribe these kind of sublime properties onto the existing order, to convince people that this is in some way providential, and that the people who are elevated above them are better than them in certain kinds of ways, even providentially better in certain kind of fashions. And this is something that conservatives down to the present day have very much understood. Let's just talk about Donald Trump for a second. In The Art of the Deal, Donald Trump talks a little bit about how he uses truthful hyperbole to manipulate people essentially into buying into whatever he's doing. No surprise, he's a salesman first and foremost. But he also says, look, ordinary people don't often think very big themselves, but they can get extremely excited and activated by people who do think big, who do project these kind of grandiose, hyperbolic visions onto the world. And that's very much in continuation, albeit less rhetorically sophisticated, with this Burkean instinct that if you want to be a leader, you need to be larger than life, bigger, more powerful, more exciting, because then people will follow you and they'll be willing, of course, to send you $20 a month for Trump steaks if they think they're going to be the most sublime steaks that they're ever going to have. And then I guess the third thing that I'd like to point out is Burke has this very pronounced anti-intellectual attitude that relates back to what I was talking about before. That's also going to continue down to the current day when you hear conservatives constantly talk about the university professors, the left-wing intellectuals, these kinds of coastal elites who spend too much time at Harvard, etc. At one point, Burke says that the fundamental problem with all these rationalist critiques is that they strip away what he calls all the pleasing illusions that hold society together. And it's really telling that he says they are pleasing illusions. Doesn't mean that they're real, but his insistence is, what are you going to do without them? And he says, if you strip away all the pleasing illusions that hold society together, what is a king but a man? What is a queen but a woman? And for that matter, a woman of not a particularly impressive cast. And this is precisely why we need pleasing illusions in order to sustain us and sustain our hierarchies, according to Burke. And my inclination as a leftist is to say that it's actually very damaging to people and to society to predicate your social order on this commitment that there are certain untruths that we simply cannot touch.
Burke's observation that rationality is only one small part of human nature strikes me as one of his more genuine insights,
Oh, yes.
which leads me into my next question: that is there anything from reading these sort of thinkers that you've actually absorbed into your own thinking?
Yeah, absolutely. So I just want to be really clear. In my books, I sometimes can be quite sarcastic about the right, especially when I'm dealing with people like Jordan Peterson or Charlie Kirk, people who are just, to put it bluntly, a little bit intellectually lazy. Not even a little bit,
I think
in
that's
many
warranted in
cases.
those two cases.
Yeah, but there are without a doubt some extraordinary right-wing thinkers from whom anybody could profit from reading, not just politically, but genuinely. And I don't think there's any other way of describing someone like Dostoevsky or Nietzsche or Burke, who, for me, are the three figures who are at the very summit of at least Western right-wing thought. So in terms of what I've internalized from them as genuine insights, I think that there are two that we can talk about, right? One is I think that many on the right are correct to insist that it is implausible to assume that we're ever going to perfect human nature, whether in an egalitarian society or any other kind of society. I think that human beings are going to be characterized by certain kinds of fundamental flaws and imperfections going forward. Now, I would say that precisely when we recognize that human beings are irredeemably flawed, that should be a very powerful argument for thinking that we need a more democratic and egalitarian society, precisely because inequities in power facilitate the expression of the most vulgar and vicious characteristics of human nature. But we can get into that later on. Another insight that I took from Burke, let's just go back to him, is I do think that it is true that very often a lot of leftists love human beings in general, if not too much, at least excessively, in particular human beings and societies too little, right? It's a classic kind of expression of his. And you can see that sometimes where people, especially in the United States, will try to outdo themselves in what Richard Rorty once called the kind of America sucks sweepstakes, right? Just constantly talking about how the country is shit, how its institutions are shit, its people are dumb, and nothing good can come from them. I think that if you are a socialist or a leftist that doesn't have some genuine affection for particular people, it's going to be very hard to prove to people or even to feel for yourself a genuine affection for humankind as a whole, except as a very kind of abstract entity. And I always tell people that one of the reasons I identify as a socialist is that I tend to like people. Not all of them. I think that some people can fuck right off, right? But by and large, I think the world is more interesting with people in it, and certain particular people are special to me specifically. And I think that Burke was right to foreground that sometimes that's a point that's missed by many on the left.
Okay, good answer. I think we should probably move on to liberal socialism, because that
Sure.
is your most recent book. So just to make sure I've understood the idea correctly, basically liberal socialism is the combination of liberal democratic political institutions. In particular, you want to retain individual civil and political rights, but alongside socialist economic interventions. So the public ownership of the means of production in particular. But you still might have like private ownership of like small businesses, perhaps. So it's in a way, it's kind of like market socialism. Have I understood the basic idea correctly?
Yeah, absolutely, right. So I cash this out in terms of three core principles that I argue all liberalists, socialists share to certain degrees, right? Some of them emphasize one of these principles more than another, and they all kind of interpret them differently. So the first is commitment to methodological collectivism and normative individualism, which very briefly means that socialists agree with Marx, Aristotle, Hegel, and for that matter, Rawls, right? That human beings are social animals and that we can only flourish when we recognize our mutual interdependence with one another. But they're normative individualists in saying that it's the individual and existing individuals flourishing and potentially the flourishing of future generations that is what morally matters. It's not the survival of abstract entities or the well-being of abstract entities that are very often reified. Like the nation or civilization or the Volk or whatever it happens to be, right? So that's the first principle. The second principle is a commitment to a developmental rather than acquisitive ethic. So just very briefly, an acquisitive ethic is what C.B. Macpherson would associate with certain species of possessive, or as we sometimes now call it, classical liberalism. This idea that anthropologically all human beings are, for the most part, self-interested, atomized units. They pursue that self-interested in a competitive way, either through violence in the state of nature or through competition in a capitalist society. And by and large, we compete with one another to try to gratify our basic hedonic desires as effectively as possible by acquiring things that we want, right? Or in some cases, acquiring power so that we can use that power to get more things that we want, right? Now, there's no doubt a truth to this vision of human beings, right? Anyone who's been to a Black Friday sale will know that people can be pretty shitty to each other in those circumstances. But the figures that I talk about in the book are more committed to a developmental ethic. Basically, the idea that human beings can be hedonistic, but we get a lot more gratification out of the development and use of our human capacities or powers than just hedonistic, even mindless hedonistic consumption. So, just to give a couple of examples, people who want to be parents generally feel a lot better when they become better parents than not. Somebody who wants to become a violin player gets a lot of gratification out of having a violin, taking lessons, and becoming more adept at their musicianship, right? And this is a very great good and one that is facilitated, all liberal socialists would say, by a more economically democratic society. And then the last point, which is the one principle, which is the one that's most germane to what you're talking about, is all liberal socialists are committed to this idea that we should remain committed to core liberal institutions and especially core liberal rights. Indeed, we should even expand those rights where possible, with the one qualification that all liberal socialists do not take or do not put as much weight on the right to private property as possessive liberals, let alone neoliberals or classical liberals do. All liberal socialists would say personal property is obviously something we should take very seriously. You don't want someone coming into your house whenever they want saying, well, what's mine is now yours. But private ownership of the means of production, precisely because it enables various forms of domination and inequities of power to emerge in society, so contravene our commitment to the other, more important liberal rights that we cannot permit it. Which is the second part and the socialist part of liberal socialism, which is liberal socialists are committed to this idea that we should ascribe or apply liberal principles to the economy to democratize relations of domination to the extent possible, and we should do something similar in the family as well. And in terms of what that means practically, this generally means again social ownership of the means of production through things like workplace cooperatives, market socialism in many circumstances. And you can get into more granular details of this down the line if you want, but that's basically the way that I think of the political theory of liberal socialism.
Okay, cool. I want to come back to the developmental ethic a little bit later because I think it's theoretically quite a rich area. But
Sure.
this constant question was running through my mind as I was reading your book, and that was why do we even need the term liberal socialism? Because as I've understood socialism, it's just the logical extension of liberalism into the economic sphere. And you quote throughout the book many socialists who make this point. Like, I'm not saying anything original here, that socialism kind of includes but transcends liberalism. So, if we understand socialism in that way, why do we need to add the prefix liberal? Like, what are we getting? Why do you think that prefix is important?
It's a really good question. No one's asked me that before, so kudos to you, right? Because it's thought-provoking. I think that as a preliminary response, I would go back to the introduction of the book, where I pointed out how, for many people, precisely this term struck them as inherently contradictory, even oxymoronic. And what I wanted to do was demonstrate, qua the figures in the book, that actually there is this deep affinity between liberalism and socialism. And rather than regarding the traditions as fundamentally antagonistic, the way that many liberals and socialists still do, we should regard them as complementary, or as even mutually constitutive in a certain kind of way. And I would like to be clear, this is a point that is not original to me either. So one of the main reasons I thought that this dialogue might be worth facilitating, and why we should talk about a liberal socialism, is my reading of a lot of right-wing authors. So there are these very kind of cheesy online reactionaries who basically will say that anyone to the left of Ronald Reagan is a liberal and a socialist and a commie and you get the idea, right? Those are the people I'm talking about. What I'm talking about are major right-wing thinkers like Heidegger or Nietzsche, right? All of whom insisted that, contra the insistence of many liberals and socialists themselves, there is actually a deep affinity between the doctrines. They were both fundamentally modernist outlooks grounded in a kind of humanism that thought that rationality could be applied to solve human problems and to mediate our relationship with one another and indeed with nature. And of course, Nietzsche and Heidegger thought that we should reject all of that for different reasons that we don't need to get into. But just to reference one point, an introduction to metaphysics, Heidegger says Russia and America, liberalism, capitalism, socialism are all, as you put it, metaphysically the same. Fundamentally, the difference between liberals and socialists aren't foundational. They're just technical disputes about what system of economic organization will better produce and then better distribute refrigerators to gratify more human needs. And he was just very unimpressed with this debate. So, inspired by these kinds of writers, and also this kind of sense on the part of the broader community that it was oxymoronic to talk about liberal socialism, I thought that it would be important to retrieve this tradition, precisely to demonstrate that I think that Nietzsche and Heidegger are right to insist on this affinity, but they are wrong to insist that that makes it unattractive. I think that liberal socialism is attractive precisely because it brings together many of the best insights of socialism and liberalism and demonstrates again how they can be harmonized.
Beyond just being conciliatory, though, between these two traditions, I got the sense that you think liberal theorists do a few things better than socialist theorists. In
Sure.
particular, um, maybe I'm wrong, maybe this is what I think, but you're attracted to the normative writing of liberal theorists, like John Rawls in particular. Like, you think they do the normative theorizing quite well. Is there anything that you think liberal theorists do better than socialists?
Yeah, I think that's exactly one of them. Normative theorizing, right? Although, just for our socialist and left-wing listeners, I think there are a lot of things that socialist and left writers do better than liberals, and we can get into that
Sure.
maybe subsequently. So let's just talk about Marx briefly, because I think this is where the origin of this problem comes from. There's a lot of stupendous work being done in political theory right now, unpacking Marx's political and ethical thought and demonstrating the richness of it, right? I'm thinking about people like Vanessa Williams in her book on Marx's ethical theory, or Bruno Leopold, who wrote a really good book, Citizen Marx, on Marx's republicanism. All that aside, there is no doubt that the classical way of understanding Marx, certainly for many, was as resolutely hostile to any kind of moral theory, or moralism, as it was called. We shouldn't be writing recipe books for the cook shops of the future, to use this famous expression. And there are many different instantiations of this, right? Anyone who kind of talks about how socialism is a scientific rather than a normative kind of aspiration or theory, kind of gesture towards that. You can think about Althusser, right, who famously said there was a young Marx who immaturely toyed around with certain kind of ethical arguments derived from Hegel, and then a mature Marx who just dropped all that, etc., etc., etc. And for these reasons, and the kind of stamp of this attitude, it just is the case that I don't think that many socialists ever really developed as refined a skill set when it came to normative argumentation as, say, the liberal egalitarian thinkers did. And I just think that that's very transparent if you read the writings of someone like Edward Bernstein, a very intelligent man, or Carlo Rosselli, and then you compare that to the writings of Mill or Rawls, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Right? Now, that does not mean that normative theorizing is the only thing liberal socialists should be in the business of doing. I just think that if you're going to look for a model of extremely refined and sophisticated normative theorizing, it's very hard to find a better one than what's appearing in liberal egalitarian philosophy today.
Mm. And so, what underpins the normative theorizing of these egalitarian liberals, as you mentioned before, is the developmental ethic, which is, I guess, we can contrast it with the kind of acquisitive ethic of the possessive individualists like John Locke. So, rather than just getting stuff and satisfying our hedonistic desires, as you say, the view of the good life is like humans kind of developing their inherent capabilities and potentials. And for that reason, you say that John Stuart Mill is the first liberal socialist. But this idea, you find it in Marx, you find it in Mill, and you find it in Rawls. But we can actually trace it back to Aristotle.
Oh,
So
yes.
could you talk about the kind of Aristotelian heritage here in liberal socialism?
Yeah, absolutely right. So this is something that I came around to grudgingly. Actually, the pandemic inspired me to take the Aristotelian basis of this developmental ethic a lot more seriously, because during the pandemic, I kind of realized that Aristotle is very much right, that we are social creatures, and leading these kind of atomistically individuated lives separated from one another is extremely painful in certain kinds of ways, right? I don't think anybody would disagree with that. So Aristotle's own theory is, of course, extremely rich and multifaceted. We're not going to be able to get into too much detail about it here, but obviously, Aristotle argues that fundamentally we are social animals, and he develops a eudaimonist ethic to suggest that the primary motivation for being good is, of course, to achieve eudaimonia, variably translated as happiness, flourishing under the right conditions, etc. But he's very insistent that it is impossible to achieve eudaimonia or even to be an ethical person unless one is located within a human society, precisely because so many of the virtues that we need to inculcate in ourselves and so many of the capacities that we need to lead a good life can only be sufficiently developed in a social setting. Like I can't be magnanimous without someone who needs to be magnanimous too. Right. And I cannot play the violin effectively unless I am motivated to play the violin effectively because I have an audience and I have a teacher and I have a tradition of music that I'm integrating myself within. And the way that Mill and Marx understand this is obviously very different than the way that Aristotle would understand it. But fundamentally, they're capturing a similar kind of intuition, albeit highly modernized and stripped of a lot of the kind of teleological qualities that one would associate with Aristotelian ethics and metaphysics, for that matter. So Mill, drawing upon Humboldt and others, famously says that we need to see human happiness not the way that Bentham would understand it, in terms of this gratification of our hedonic urges. Instead, we need to see human life itself as a project, and we should be empowered to develop ourselves like a living tree that extends to its natural endpoint. And Mill thought, certainly by the end of his career, that a liberal socialist society that combined a democratic economy with strong protections for basic liberties would be the one that was best equipped to ensure this kind of development of the human individual like a living tree. And he emphasized the importance of the development of human capacities, drawing upon Humboldt in exactly this kind of way. And Marx actually has a very similar view in Capital Volume 3. So this is again why I reject this Althusserian idea that Marx simply dropped any references to ethical ideas in his mature work. They're still very much there. We have to kind of piece them together. So in Capital Volume 3, late, when he's talking about the Trinity formula, Marx says one of the fundamental limitations of capitalism, and also one of the virtues of capitalism, is that it's very good at helping people to develop certain kinds of capacities. The example that I usually give is pin making, right? If you live in Adam Smith's pin factory, or you work in Adam Smith's pin factory, excuse me, the capitalist social system will be very good at making sure that you get really good at making pins. Why? Because it's economically prosperous to help you get really good at making pins. But it's not going to be very good at helping you develop your other kinds of capacities because there's just no profit motive to do so. Now, you can make an argument that in the 20th century, capitalist societies got better at developing a broader range of capacities through offering things like universal primary and secondary education. And that's an important discussion and qualification we can add to this. But Marx would still say we aren't doing enough of that. And he thinks that with a transition to socialism, the development of human powers or human capacities is translated in various ways, will become an end in itself, to use his terminology for the first time. And this is going to be one of the great boons of socialism or communism that distinguishes it qualitatively from earlier kinds of societies. Now, Marx understood this very differently than Mill, but you can see there's a deep affinity there in terms of the ethical ideal that they wanted society to strive towards. And I think it's a very attractive one, right? And just to pause for a second, many liberal egalitarians and socialists, for that matter, are going to offer up iterations of this developmental ideal going forward.
Yeah, and I guess like the basic insight of socialism is that people's ability to develop their capacities shouldn't be hindered by lack of economic opportunity. So it's just kind of trying to give it's trying to create the kind of material conditions for that development to occur. But I guess part of the point for Mill as well was he wanted a society filled with eclectic individuals, I suppose. Like he wanted like people to live their own different versions of the good life, so that we kind of had like a market of like different ways of living, and that for him was part of the good society, that everyone was pursuing their own good in their own way, and that idea, pursuing your own good in your own way, I agree, does sound very similar to Marx's idea of developing our capacities for their own sake. But the question I wanted to ask you about this, because I agree with you, it is a very attractive vision. But there's something that comes across in your chapter on Wollstonecraft and Mill, and that is the cultural elitism of these thinkers.
Oh, yes.
And I wanted to ask you whether or not the developmental ethic might sort of be necessarily tainted with a form of elitism, because there seems to me that this assumption that if we just educate everyone, it seems to me to be grounded in basically kind of like looking down upon the tastes and habits of poor people. And if we educate everyone, they'll all develop bourgeois intellectual interests. Like under communism, everyone will be reading literature and going to the theater. Like there won't be any more like crude interests anymore. Like cultural elitism to me seems to run quite deep in this vein of leftism. Do you think that's accurate, or is that just like a quirk of these sort of 18th century thinkers?
Oh, I think it's extremely accurate, right? Although I would add the qualification that I do not think that this is unique to left intellectuals. I think that intellectuals across the political spectrum have by and large been deeply dissatisfied that the majority of people don't seem particularly engaged by intellectual pursuits and let's call it high cultural interests. The difference is that leftists, like Wollstonecraft or Mill, think that people can be educated to value these things, whereas conservatives sometimes gesture in that direction. I think we should be doing more, but tend to follow Strauss in thinking, actually, this is always going to be the pursuit of a fairly rarefied elite, and there's not going to be any kind of changing that. So to get to the more germane political question, I think that undoubtedly, if you read Wollstonecraft or Mill, they align this kind of anxiety about the masses' intellectual deficiencies with a kind of reservation about the dangers of too much democracy. Now, I want to be very clear, right? Compared to conservatives, Wollstonecraft was enormously in favor of republicanism, and Mill, for all his reservations about certain aspects of democracy, perennially endorsed something like universal suffrage, including for women, right, which was radical at the time, and would very much put him on the left end of the political spectrum at that point. But Wollstonecraft said we need to educate people to be prepared for democracy, and Mill himself also endorsed that idea, right? We need to educate people to be prepared for democracy, and maybe until everyone is sufficiently educated, the more intellectually refined should have plural votes on major kinds of decisions. And that's not just elitist. It also speaks to, I think, a deeper impulse on the left that we really need to abandon at some point. And this is where I agree with conservative thinkers like Deneen, as I'll get to in a minute, which is that we can perfect human beings and elevate them up to a shared remarkable level. And this will bring about a utopian society where, to use Trotsky's term, everyone will become a Marx, an Aristotle, a Goethe, and beyond that, greater horizons will appear. Deneen, who's a very intelligent conservative author, describes this as a kind of democratic perfectionism that's always been a latent temptation on the left. And he says that it's incorrect to assume that even if you produce the most egalitarian and democratic society, people are going to rise en masse to this level. And I think it's true. However, unlike those conservatives, I do not think that that is a reason to abandon a commitment to liberal socialism or any other kind of egalitarian outlook. And I think there are a couple of reasons for this, but I'll just give two. First off, I think that to the developmental ethic point, even if people are enabled to develop their fundamental capacities and don't use them to become master violinists or to read Plato all day, but instead just become really good players, really good parents or really good hockey players, that is still an advance for human flourishing, right? Not everyone needs to aspire to become Neil Armstrong, or Louis Armstrong, for that matter, to lead a good life. Sometimes it's enough to be a good dad, take your kid to hockey, get him a hot dog at the end of it, and being able to do that because you have things like paternity leave or disability leave, the way that many people don't around a lot of the world right now, right? And secondly, I would argue it is without a doubt a mistake to assume that we're ever going to perfect human beings. But when we recognize, and this is what I talked about earlier, that human beings are fundamentally flawed, we should be very suspicious that a hierarchical society is one that is sustainable forever, precisely because enabling social hierarchies of a particularly brutal type allows for this expression of the most vulgar, domineering, and tyrannical forms of human life and the human personality. And through the democratization of power that would be carried out by something like liberal socialism, even if we don't elevate people, we inhibit the possibility of the worst kind of inclinations in human nature be given full reign and free expression. And I think that that is a very worthy reason to pursue it.
Completely agree. Although the reason I asked the question is because it does kind of have contemporary electoral consequences because the left now, mainly in America, but it's happening a little bit here as well, it
Oh yeah.
is being quite effectively portrayed as out of touch, overeducated cultural elites that are sort of preoccupied with these kind of highfalutin things, not concerned with like material interests of the everyday person. Um, but more importantly, and this is why I ask about the elitism, is there's a sense that like a lot of the progressive, well-educated left like doesn't actually like the working class as individual people. Like they just kind of want to fundamentally change them. And so there's this kind of bemusement, like why is the working class increasingly shifting towards the right? Because it seems to me that they don't feel looked down upon but by the political right.
Yeah, absolutely. I thought about this quite a bit. And if people want a good book on this, my buddy Ben Burgess, who did come from blue collar Michigan, wrote a good book, controversial, called "Canceling Comedians While the Word Burns." Anyway, I don't want to dive too much into this because this is more about a kind of Gramscian theory on organic intellectuals. But just to make a long story short, I think that with the kind of breakdown of labor movements, pushes for socialism on the part of the working class in the 1980s, a lot of the left became dominated by intellectuals and academics and artists. Now, I'm an academic. I'm not going to shit where I eat, and I think that there are a lot of wonderful things about academics. Academics can be really curious and very interesting, and they're very passionate about their subject matter, and all that's good. And I'm guessing since you do what you do, you'd probably agree with that most days, or some days at least. But I think that one consequence of this is that a lot of the kind of values that the left came to articulate and espouse are very much the kind of values and rhetorics and aesthetics that intellectuals and academics tend to cherish. Just to give two quick examples, the only kind of hierarchical flex that I've noticed anyone in the left is not only okay with, but actually people tend to double down on in a lot of circumstances, is nobody ever has a problem if you say, I'm smarter and better educated and more well-read than you. And you should really go back and read more of Wendy Brown's reading of Das Kapital, etc., because you just don't know shit, right? And that is, without a doubt, a kind of hierarchical condescension that we are paying to someone, or that we are demonstrating to someone who just doesn't really know as much as we do, or so we think. Now, look, don't get me wrong. Sometimes I'll do the same thing when I'm dealing with annoying right wingers who are fucking like, where did you ever write about this? It's like, well, it's right here. If you want, you can go read it and stop bothering me about this kind of stuff. But when we kind of adopt this epistocratic attitude towards politics and towards ranking people, we shouldn't be surprised when that starts to extend outwards towards the working class people and the marginalized people that we are purportedly trying to help, and can come across as sneering and condescending towards them. And rightly so, right? And I think we really need to inoculate ourselves against the worst aspects of these kind of epistocratic inclinations. Even while as academics and intellectuals, we still need to hold ourselves to a very high standard indeed, especially now when we need to be at our sharpest in confronting the right. The other thing that I'd point to is I think that when you have a left that's dominated by academics and intellectuals, what you really see people argue for is the importance of novelty, radicalness for its own sake, creativity, all the kind of things that artists and intellectuals tend to cherish and value. And, I sometimes make fun of this a little bit, and why not here, right? I see this in a lot of socialist writing today, right, where people say we need an ever more radical critique of the contemporary status quo and American society or Canadian society or wherever it is, because an ever more radical critique is the kind of thing that really appeals to intellectuals. It sounds exciting, right? You're going further than anyone has gone before. But I think to ordinary people, if you sit there and say, we're going to radically criticize your society, it's entirely plausible that they'll feel a certain kind of possessiveness and defensiveness about that. And they'll say, what are you doing? Shitting on the place where I live, or shitting on my culture's values, or sitting there saying, I'm too stupid to recognize the world that I happen to live in. Who are you to do that? Now, I think that we do need to engage in radical critique. I want to be very clear about this. But this is where I think that people like Michael Walzer, problematic thinker, are right. That if you're going to try to convince people to buy into a progressive project, rather than sitting there saying to them, you need to adopt this entirely different set of values because your values are crap, you sit there and say, look, if you really believe in American principles of liberty for all and equality for all, and not having people look down on you, shouldn't we not live in the kind of plutocratic society that we can see all around us right now? Isn't there something really unfree about going to work and having your boss tell you that you're going to wear what he tells you, you're going to have lunch when he tells you, you're going to get on the phone with people when he tells you, and he's also going to police your social media because you're going to be friends and associate with the people that he tells you? Seems to be something pretty un-American about that. And this kind of imminent critique that can be very radical, I think is a lot more persuasive to people because you're treating them with a certain degree of respect. You're saying, you and I believe the same kinds of things and your values are just fine, but this is the right way, or a more rich way is probably a better way of putting it, of understanding those. And if you really want a society that is free and equal, like you say you do, why not move in this direction, since that seems to be something we both care about?
Completely agree, and it's one of the reasons why I've always found it puzzling that many people on the left shy away from patriotism, because just politically speaking, it seems to be a really bad thing to do tactically to not be patriotic because most people are, and they get, as you say, possessive about their country, if you're radically critiquing it. There are
Yeah,
so
just to
many
give one quick
avenues. Yeah,
example,
yeah,
this is a really funny one. When the Olympics were last going on, I saw a lot of leftists be like, God, why are we doing these sporting events? This is such a waste of time. People should be dealing with like more important things when the world is burning. And I was like, maybe, but man, do you really want to be the fucking group that's known as like the anti-sports, like that is anti-sports? Do you not know how much
yeah.
people fucking love sports, right? Like, it's a non-starter for a lot of people. Just sit there and have a hot dog and go to a hot dog to a football game for a little while, right? You'll relax a little bit.
Absolutely. So I don't want to take this conversation too much down the route of electoral politics and the problems with the really existing left. So we'll jump back into the theory. My two favorite chapters, and you'll be very pleased to hear this because this was your goal, were the chapters on Marx and Rawls.
Thank you.
Um,
Yeah.
And that's because I came towards a greater appreciation of liberalism after kind of being forced, reluctantly at first, to read Rawls for my doctoral research. But then I just kind of, the more I understood what Rawls was doing, the more admiration I had for his kind of normative project. So when you described yourself as a Rawlsian Marxist or a Marxist Rawlsian, I was pretty ecstatic. I was like, oh yes, like I'm not confused. This is a thing. So could you talk more about these two thinkers and how you think they can be reconciled and why you yourself identify as a Rawlsian Marxist?
Sure. Well, this is a good point of covering my ass a bit and saying, look, my book is a retrieval of the political theory of liberal socialism that is intended, as my wife put it, to make this tradition available to those like yourself and myself, because we want to situate ourselves in this kind of terrain, and it's helpful to understand yourself in a tradition in order to make sense of some of these questions. Now, I identify as a Rawlsian Marxist because I think that these thinkers, for me, represent the best of the left. And this actually goes back to some of the point I made about normative theorizing earlier. I think that Rawls offers a very normatively powerful argument for an egalitarian society that is extraordinarily well defended, and also in many ways commonsensical, which is a rare combination, right? Because I think that there's something that's very intuitively plausible about saying, if you were to design the society that would work in your self-interest, but you didn't know these facts about yourself, you didn't know who you were going to be, what kind of principles of justice would you choose? And they would probably look a lot like Rawlsian principles. On the other hand, I think that what Marx offers to liberal socialism, and indeed the left tradition in general, is a much richer account of power than what you usually find in liberal thinking. And this is where I think liberals have been very deficient relative to the left. If you look at left critical theory and Marxist critical theory, you find this very extraordinary and rich discussion of different kinds of power that exist in society, ideological forms of power, discursive forms of power, if we want to be Foucauldian. Obviously, the mute compulsion that capitalist relations of production can impose upon all us, with all the domination that that entails. And there's just really nothing that is even remotely comparable to this extremely sophisticated account of power in the liberal traditions, where power is typically understood well up into the 19th century exclusively in terms of state power, or almost exclusively in terms of state power. And even in the 20th century, when figures like Rawls were starting to move in that direction, it's just still not on the same level as what you find in the left tradition. So, what I want to do, or what I'd hope to do in a future project, is bring a Marxist account and understanding of power into the Rawlsian tradition, and integrate them together into a full defense of the liberal socialist tradition. That would be kind of a characteristic of what I think is the best way well, to defend these principles going forward. But the book doesn't actually do that because I'm still thinking through how to kind of bring these two, in many ways, very different thinkers together. So you'll have to give me a little time on that to think through the right way to go about it. I'm not quite there yet.
I look forward to that with great interest because that's basically where my thinking is evolving in the direction of as well. So your book came out at a very opportune time for just my own kind of intellectual development. So we're at 45 minutes. So just to kind of, I just wanted to ask you a couple of final questions about the plausibility of liberal socialism as a political project,
Mhm.
and whether or not you actually think it's internally consistent and stable in a Rawlsian sense. Because if liberal socialism is going to remain committed to free and fair elections, liberal parliamentary institutions, what's to stop a kind of libertarian, neoliberal, conservative coalition from just coming to power after 4 or 5 years and rolling back all the socialist advances that we make? Like, how is the system ever actually going to get off the ground if you remain committed to liberal democratic institutions?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it's a question that in some ways takes us beyond ideal theory into the kind of realm of issues that Marxists are much better equipped to think through, which is again related to the first question. So I think that there are a couple of responses to this. I think that liberal socialists or progressives generally need to be much more committed to institution building than they were throughout much of the 20th century. So, just to give an example, right, social democratic movements, by and large, were extremely good, at least for a while, at exercising state power in order to redistribute wealth through offering public goods to citizenry. And this is a noble project. There's no denying about that. However, if you look at many countries, let's just take the United States as an example, even in the heyday of FDR to Lyndon Johnson, union density was only ever about 25, maybe 35%, depending on who you grade that, right? That is not a particularly high number. And this meant that when the neoliberal counterassault against even the very modest kind of social democratic reforms came in the United States, there were very few non-state institutions or non-party institutions available to resist this in any particularly pronounced way, which is why when Ronald Reagan essentially told striking workers that they go back to work or they'll be fired, there wasn't a mass uprising the way that there was even in, say, the United Kingdom when Margaret Thatcher tried to implement her reforms. But even there, unions were clearly not sufficiently strong to resist the Thatcherite revolution over the long term for a variety of different reasons. So contemporary leftists would really need to try to rebuild those kinds of institutions and other complementary ones if there's going to be success going forward, precisely because when you lose electoral power and you don't have those institutions, it's far easier to reform society without any significant pushback. The second thing that I think needs to be done is something that very much like what you're doing. I think that leftists need to become a lot better at developing Gramscian kinds of cultural power because right now, the reality is that the right is absolutely killing us at the internet game. Not just in the United States, but also Canada, where I'm from, the United Kingdom, France, for that matter, Brazil, right? Many other kinds of instances. And there are a lot of reasons for that. I don't think it's from a lack of effort on our part, but I really do think that there needs to be a concerted push to try to reach a broader audience, to develop the kinds of soft power that'll be necessary to culturally entrench and then expand our values in the event that we lose electoral power. And then I guess third and most important, in the event that leftists do take power, there needs to be a much more pronounced effort made at democratizing the economy. And this was the big mistake that even the Social Democrats in Sweden made. So in the 1970s, there was a proposal put forward by the left wing of the Swedish Social Democratic Party called the Meidner Plan, which essentially held that the trade unions that represented workers in large firms would receive stock over a period of years to the point where they would own 51% of the company. And then, ta-da, you'd have worker ownership of the means of production carried out without any kind of violent insurrection, right? And this would, of course, be facilitated by the Swedish state, led by the Swedish Social Democratic Party. It was an extraordinary idea that was never carried through to fruition because Swedish capital, which was willing to acclimate to the welfare state, saw this as a fundamental challenge to its power and spent an enormous sums of money trying to inhibit it. And then they were successful. They waited it out until the neoliberal era came, and then nothing like the Meidner Plan was implemented. Now, what I think this demonstrates is that in the event that social democratic or democratic socialist or liberal socialist parties come to power, there needs to be this democratization of the economy carried out as quickly as possible, precisely because if one does not do that, it'll be very easy for capital to mount a counteroffensive when the timing seems right to it and for it, and it will very likely be successful. So I think this is the big mistake, even the most radical of the social democratic parties made in the 1960s and 70s, and it's one that we cannot repeat in the event that we are in a position where we are powerful enough to potentially repeat it.
I think I've become a lot more sympathetic to the cultural observation, just as you were talking, because you were talking about the union movement. And I sort of thought, well, like even in Australia during the 70s, the union movement was incredibly powerful. Over 50% of the population was unionized. The Australian Council of Trade Unions exercised political power on a par with the Business Council. And yet that didn't stop the tide of neoliberalism. In fact, it came entirely from within the centre-left party in Australia, from the former head of the Council of Trade Unions, Bob Hawke. So I think, okay, perhaps that's not enough, right? Just having strong unions is necessary but not sufficient. So perhaps the cultural point is a good one. And
No,
yeah,
this is just where I'll interject and say one of the most telling observations that Margaret Thatcher made uh, late in life, after she was prime minister, she was asked, "What was your biggest success?" And she said, "Well, it was clearly Tony Blair. Why? Well, because we got the Labour Party to change its mind, right? And that is
yeah,
really demonstrative of just what you're talking about, right? Tony Blair won huge, right? Massive, massive electoral victory in the 1990s, but then carried through many of the same kind of neoliberal reforms as Thatcher did, because culturally the right was ascendant and was able to make its case for neoliberalization to such a degree that even socialists became convinced of it. And I think that we need to try to acquire the same kind of cultural power for ourselves.
couldn't agree more. And perhaps it's also one of the reasons why you included Mouffe and agonism in the
Yes.
book to remind the left that, as you say, to quote Angela Davis, freedom is a constant struggle. We can't be trying to like close the book on these struggles. Like it's constant. It's always, and that is, I think, one of the insights of liberalism as well, that political conflict is sort of interminable and we're never going to completely resolve it. And I think that socialists can absorb that lesson.
Yeah, absolutely, right. I love that quote by Davis that freedom is a constant struggle. And I would argue that democracy is a constant struggle as well. So I think that one of the great errors that many leftists can fall into, this is a point that Hirschman makes in The Rhetoric of Reaction, is this presumption that the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice inevitably. It's a beautiful, soaring quote by Dr. King. But what it leads to is this kind of teleological vision that given enough time, we're just going to become victorious. And any kind of victory that we claim will be immutable. No one will be able to push it back. I think that certainly the 20th century has demonstrated that progress is certainly not inevitable. Revanchism is also very much a possibility. And as we're seeing right now around the world, very militant and very domineering forms of revanchism. So there are no guarantees that we're going to win. But there's also some reasons to be optimistic in that because it also means that the tide of reaction that we're faced with right now is not inevitable either. It is very possible to overturn it, and that's what I think we should be in the business of doing as pronouncedly as possible.
The future is for the making.
That's right.
Okay, I think that's a fantastic place to leave it. Thank you so much. And thank you for listening. If you've made it all the way to the end, I can only assume that you enjoyed the episode. So if you haven't already, please rate the podcast. Thank you so much and see you next time.